connecting. Morena, everyone. We've got people joining us. We'll get started in just a moment as everyone finishes joining us in this today's session. Great. All right. Now haere mai kia ora koutou katoa ko Austin toko ingoa. Welcome everyone. My name is Austin and I'm your host today. Thank you so much for joining us in this climate jargon, climate claims webinar. So today's webinar is focused on making climate performance claims. How do you talk about your carbon action? You know you're doing good work, but potentially you've seen some greenwash accusations out there, making you a bit nervous about making your own claims with confidence. You know, those accusations of greenwashing are getting more nuanced. How do you build trust in your claims? How can you have that confidence in talking about them? So today's content is about helping you and supporting you in making those really robust claims. We'll start out with some of the leading practice context, the trends that we've been seeing to help inform of the space that we're making these claims in. We'll look at some of the key language and the way things are evolving there. We'll look at how to talk about some of your climate action initiatives, things that work and things that aren't working. And we'll show you a few examples of some of the updates we at Toitū have been making with our carbon programs to help support our clients in making those leading practice climate claims. So we're your speakers today. I'm Austin. I'm one of the product managers at Toitū Envirocare. I look after our carbon programs, and a particular passion of mine is the way we talk about climate performance. Talking about climate change and the actions we're taking is a really key action to help accelerate change. But as more and more of us are making those claims, which is great, there's also more and more scrutiny and carbon washing. So how we're making those claims with integrity and transparency is really important. We also have Stu with us today. Stu has 20 years in this field and is one of my very favorite brains to pick. So I'm really delighted to be sharing his expertise with you guys today. Stu's one of our senior technical advisors. He's focused on emission reductions and neutrality and still manages to keep tabs on all the local and global developments around climate performance here. So we can take that and use it to inform our members and help you guys understand that leading practice. So we're going to start with some of that context. I'm going to hand you over to Stu, and he's going to take us through some of the context and trends that we're seeing with that leading practice.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you, Austin. So starting off on discourse on leading practice in the voluntary carbon claims. Now, there's a lot of it happening. There's a lot of new discourse coming out all the time. What I've got up on screen here is just a selection of what we're tracking. In particular, up on the top right, there is the ICROA, International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance. Toitū is a member of that alliance, and every year we get audited against the Code of Best Practice. So that's one that obviously we track and make sure we align to. The other one that we see emerging is the VCMI, or the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative. That released a document last year, and it'll also due to release a new one coming up in April. And I'll talk about that. It's all about addressing what they call demand-side integrity. I'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. You might have also heard about the Race to Zero campaign. That's a global campaign pulling together a whole lot of initiatives around trying to get to a net zero end state. And then across on the left of the screen there, ISO is actually working on a carbon neutrality standard. It's in draft form at the moment, but we're anticipating that to come out later this year. And you might have also heard of Science-Based Targets Initiative, SBTI. They released what they call the net zero standard back around about the time of COP26. And that's a reasonably definitive framework for what corporates should be striving for in terms of achieving a net zero claim. And then closer to home in the middle there, MFE, as recently as last week, released some guidance in this space as well. And you'll notice they've released it called interim guidance. And that's, again, appreciating the fact that this lead practice is evolving all the time. And so it is a case of tracking and navigating what the implications are of this lead practice. And then for us at Toitū is looping that back into how we operate our program. Next slide, please, Austin. So there's various terminologies out there. This is just a snapshot. It is literally just a sample, thanks to SBTI and Trove Research releasing this one. You may have heard of other terminologies out there, and these sort of terms are being released almost on a daily basis by companies worldwide, sort of coming out with claims or commitments on what they're trying to achieve. This table sets it out in sort of themes or areas, but for all of the terms you see on screen here, it's likely that every organisation has some different interpretations of what they mean by that statement. Okay, so we'll talk about that a little bit further on in the talk. Next slide, please, Austin. Related back to that lead practice slide I had, generally most of the initiatives in Discourse agree that there's some real key principles to be following. And VCMI summarise it up quite nicely on what's called the Demandside Integrity. Now, this is just a selection of the principles, but ones that really stick out as being important. So on the left of the screen here, there's a real call for a focus to be on avoiding, or sorry, you would have heard of the term of mitigation hierarchy. Expect that term to be thrown around a lot more. But it's all about trying to avoid emissions in the first place. If you can't avoid them, then reduce them. So think of, say, a business trip, trying to actually avoid having to do the business trip in the first place. If you do have to do the business trip, well, think about a lower emissions intensity option, such as cycling or using an electric vehicle. And only then do you use this neutralisation or compensation or offsetting. There's various terminologies thrown around in that end point. But it's all about really focusing on reducing emissions as much as possible. Another key principle is on the bottom right of the screen there around, this example is for organisation emissions measurement and management and offsetting, is about being transparent about what you're addressing in your claim. So are you just looking at your direct category 1 and 2 or scope 1 and 2 emissions? Or are you going further up and looking at indirect or scope 3 emissions? Might be a subset of the full value chain, or are you looking at the whole value chain? And that's really important in terms of the significance of where your emissions are occurring. Austin's got a great slide further on that talks about this component. And then on the top of the screen here, it's addressing transparency around the claims. So often we've seen organisations coming out saying with a headline claim, saying, hey, we're going to be 50% reduction by 2030, or we're going to be carbon neutral by 2025, or net zero by 2040. But there's a real call for adding more narrative and substance behind what you mean by that and how you're going to get to that commitment. And in relation to that is there's an element of achievement versus commitment claims. So this was really apparent during Glasgow COP26. A lot of organisations coming out saying, hey, we're making pledges or commitments. Those are commitment claims, but now they need to turn around and say, okay, well, how are we actually mapping our progress towards that commitment claim? So that's where your achievements comes into it. So communications is effectively going to be a mixture of achievement and commitments. Next slide, please, Austin. So that was demand side integrity. When we talk about supply side integrity, this is in the context of tradable carbon credits, the carbon credit market. And what's been called for here is as there's more demand for carbon credits from all these companies and actors trying to get to net zero states or carbon neutral states, the market needs to scale in terms of volume, but at the same time, in tandem, it needs to scale up with good credit quality. So some of those core principles are outlined on the left of the screen there. one of the key ones is additionality. So being able to demonstrate that these carbon credits are needing the carbon finance to go over and above business as usual practices. So it's all about expediting action over and above existing practices. In the middle there, we've got the core principles around standards that issue the credits. You might have heard of gold standard, Vera, for example. And also what registries those credits sit on, making sure that any stakeholder can actually jump onto a registry and publicly trace back and say, oh, yep, okay, here's the public record of where that sits. And then on the right there, we've got additional attributes. This is the sort of aligning additional sort of premium benefits in terms of it might be alignment to sustainable development goals. You might have preferences around what sort of project type you're looking for, what sort of location you're wanting to support your efforts against too. So what you're seeing on screen here is being pushed by the TSVCM, or what's currently known as the Integrity Council for Voluntary Carbon Markets. So they're sort of rolling out these core principles and trying to get that into the overall scaling of the market. Okay, next slide, please, Austin. We're also seeing more interest in terms of how to account across the whole value chain in terms of on the top of the diagram here, looking at where the emissions occur, right upstream of the supply chain in terms of raw materials, distribution, freight, etc., right down to the end user. But on the bottom here is acknowledging and saying, okay, where do removals occur within that overall value chain? And then how does that map through to the net emissions balance? And ultimately, how does that map through to a carbon claim as well? So we're seeing more interest in that. A recent example is the SBTI, Science-Based Targets Initiative, flag sector guidance for target setting as well, and seeing where removal sits within that as well. Next slide, please, Austin. Now, with the Paris Agreement really settling in, and this is sort of progressed a lot with the Glasgow COP26, is around accounting rules and how double counting fits into this. Prior to Paris Agreement pre-2020, it was reasonably clear cut in terms of where emissions sat, but now we need to be aware of things like double issuance, double use. So double use, for example, is where a company might hold a carbon credit, they make some sort of carbon claim, but then that credit gets sold on to another entity. That entity makes another claim as well. So that can be addressed by actually cancelling the unit off the registry and taking it out of circulation, so it can't be used more than once. Of particular interest is this thing called double claiming, and in the example on the screen here, this is often gets the interest around countries saying, hey, we're going to account for this removal or reduction in our national accounts and use that to demonstrate our compliance to our nationally determined contribution under Paris, or NDC. But the company that's helping finance that project is also using that mitigation against their organisation claim or product claim. Okay, so that's the concept of double claiming. Next slide, please, Austin. The other thing with the Paris market is we're going from a transition to where there's almost a convergence of markets between what was previously voluntary and compliance markets. We're now, in this example here, the key message is that a standard such as gold standard was traditionally issuing credits for voluntary purposes, but now there's actually potential for those credits to be sought after or purchased by both countries for NDC commitments, carrying on with voluntary offsetting, but also the aviation Corsair offsetting scheme. And there's also an element of what the country set in terms of authorizations. And what it all means is that it flows through to the message that the various carbon credits on the marketplace are fit for purpose for certain communication claims. Okay, so it all comes through to how the communication claim gets described and the transparency around that. Next slide, please, Austin. So just to summarize up, we're moving from the left of the screen here from a sort of current status quo. We've been using what we call pre-2020 vintage credits. There's no double claiming scenario there. We're now moving to a transition phase where we're anticipating double claiming as being an unavoidable reality. And this is a reflection of the time that it takes for some of the COP26 Article 6 rules to sort of start to take effect and be available in the market. And then we're moving into the longer term where, I mean, these are rough timeframes. We're expecting around 2025, there'll be a more opportunity to address that double claiming scenario and have credits that can reflect the communication claims as such. And you'll notice that we're anticipating more use of that removals concept within the value chain as well, and some more solidification of sort of lead practice in that space as well. And then ultimately longer term, by the year 2050 or ideally sooner, is that we're expecting a shift in the carbon credit market space, that all what we call reduction and avoidance projects will be successful, and we'll have an economy where as much carbon as possible will be squeezed out of the system. And so essentially we get left with just the residual, really hard to abate emissions, and those will be used with removal projects, which is projects that actually draw down emissions from the atmosphere, either in a nature-based forest removal, for example, project, or an engineered capture system. And they'll be used really sparingly just for those hard to abate emissions. Okay, and that's when you sort of get into the SBTI net zero end state sort of definitions as well. Okay, so that's just setting the scene, and I'll hand over to Austin to carry on.
Great, thank you so much, Stu. I think one of the interesting things there is that it's clear we're in a bit of a transition phase, and that's also really true with the language. We're seeing that a lot of the terms and the language that's being used in this space is also transitioning. So we wanted to go through a few of those key terms that are either, they mean something new or they're evolving a bit, and what you should be aware of as you're making your own claims in the market. So let's start with the really basics things. So greenhouse gases, when you're making a climate performance claim, you are usually referring to a whole suite of greenhouse gases. So you can always talk about, my greenhouse gas emissions. But carbon is often and perfectly validly used as shorthand for those, in part because of the way we do the math. The greenhouse gases, those 7 gases, are converted to carbon dioxide equivalents when you're doing the balance sheet. And so talking about it, as carbon as a bit of a shorthand is perfectly acceptable. The thing to keep in mind is, for your particular sector, for your audience, you may still need to call out specific gases within those. That might be carbon, but it also might be, say, methane. If you're working in the agriculture sector, you produce beef products, something like that. You may need to be calling out specific gases, but in general, using carbon as shorthand for the entire suite of gases, totally acceptable still. We're also seeing climate used a lot more. And climate is nice because it can refer to all the gases, but it can also refer to things beyond simple greenhouse gas accounting. So it's a way of, you can look a little bit more at some of the adaptation and transition impacts, as well as the strict accounting balance. So for example, Toitū has our carbon reduce and our carbon zero programs, but for the latest program, we went ahead and called it climate positive. And that was to reflect the fact that the program requirements, they go beyond sort of carbon and greenhouse gas accounting. They're looking more broadly at the climate, the ways that you can adapt and transition to those broader impacts. Now, scope and boundaries. So Stu talked about this a little bit already. It's really important to be very transparent and clear about what are you talking about? What are you including when you're talking about what you've measured, where you're going to be reducing, what your future state goals are? Including that scope and boundaries is really important. And there's a few different terms that are perfectly acceptable to be using in this space, depending on who your audience is, how specific you need to be. So at the broadest level, direct, indirect, and value chain emissions. So your direct emissions, those are the ones you're probably quite familiar with. You have the most direct control over them. Typically, that's sort of the core emissions within your operational boundaries, the company car that you own that's, burning petrol that you have paid for, sort of owned materials, moving out further out to the value chain. Oops, sorry guys. So when you're talking about these things, there's two key frameworks that use slightly different language, and both of them are very valid. So the GHG protocol standard uses language like scope 1 and 2, which you're probably somewhat familiar with. It's the most common language. ISO 14064 Part 1, the accounting standard, they also used to use scopes, and in the newest version of the standard, they're now using category. But a lot of the allocations of which activities fit into which space are very similar still. So looking at those direct emissions, your scope 1s, the things that you own, the fuel that you're combusting directly within your boundary. Scope 2, category 2, that purchased energy. So the emissions from generating electricity that you're purchasing off the grid. Then as you're moving below the surface, right, it gets harder to see, a little bit harder to measure, a little bit harder to influence here. So these are your indirect emissions, often sort of broadly referred to as scope 3, though GHG protocol does break scope 3 down into 15 categories for sort of upstream and downstream. And in the new ISO standard, they use category 3 through 6 to do similar groupings. And so this is everything from, your business travel, freight, waste, but also things like, staff commutes, visitor travel, the purchased goods and services, your investments, the use of your goods and services that you provide by your customers, end of life, all of that stuff. And so when you're using the language here, a lot of these terms are perfectly valid, and depending on your audience, talking about direct emissions or scope 1 and 2 emissions can work. Direct and indirect can be a little bit more approachable for a lot of the audience, but when you're talking about, this is my verified achievement, this is my specific target, it can be really helpful to align with that precise language. My scope 1 and 2 target is this, my scope 3 target is this, and how I'm going to do that through these activities to reduce emissions. On average, the reason that this iceberg metaphor works so well is that on average, that value chain impact is about 11 times bigger than your operational footprint. For some sectors, it can be even much larger. And it's also a lot harder to influence. So it's, it's that stuff below the surface, but it is still part of your responsibility. And what we're seeing in climate performance claims is that if you're not accounting for that, starting to show how are you thinking about that work? What are you doing? If you're not including those scope 3 emissions, you're probably going to get a lot of flack. So it's definitely something to be keeping in mind. How are you working in that space? What are you doing? What are your targets? And how can you talk about it? Right, so you've measured your emissions, and many of us are thinking about how can we compensate for some of those impacts while we're working to reduce our emissions? How can we counterbalance the impacts that we're having on the climate? Now, the language here is evolving a bit as well. Stu's already touched on some of these things. Compensate. Compensate is a really nice blanket term to use in this space. How are you compensating for your emissions, for your impacts? That compensation could be through purchasing and canceling carbon credits. It could be done through carbon removals in a forest that you own. Some way of balancing those scales out. How are you paying that debt? How are you compensating? Now, the term neutralize, on the other hand, is coming to mean something much more specific. It's specifically removals. So you've neutralized emissions when you've drawn down the gases out of the atmosphere, and that's how you truly neutralized. So not every carbon credit would neutralize your impacts, but they would all compensate for them. So we would recommend using compensate as a blanket term. Offsets, insets, really this is kind of where is that counterbalance activity taking place. With an offset, it tends to be the counterbalance activity is happening outside of your value chain. So potentially you're purchasing a carbon credit from a project, domestically or overseas, but a project that's separate from you. Insets tend to refer to the removals that are happening and that you're able to sort of account for and allocate within your boundary or within your value chain. And those things are kind of still being allocated and effectively canceled, so they're not being counted more than once, but they're happening within your value chain. Now, as far as the types of carbon credits that you can see, Some of the language that you're going to probably see are around things like avoidance credits or potentially reduction credits. So those are carbon credit projects that are avoiding or reducing emissions compared to business as usual. So purchasing that credit is funding a project, for example, that is building a wind farm to replace a coal boiler for electricity generation. Removal credits, just like they sound, are actually removing and drawing down emissions from the air and pulling them out of the atmosphere. So at the moment, most often those removal credits are going to be forestry type credits, but we can expect to see more nature-based solutions over time, things like marine or wetland sequestration, but also man-made solutions, so carbon capture technologies as that gets more mature. Finally, non-credited removals, which does sound like a bit of a mouthful of jargon. It's basically just a way of referring to some of those inset type projects. It's a removal like a forestry block that you own or that's in your value chain. It's not part of the ETS, it's not part of a carbon credit project, but it's being accounted for as part of your emissions, your balance sheet. And so those are non-credited removals because they're not part of a carbon credit framework necessarily. Right, so we're going to take this graph as a bit of an example. Let's pretend it's a company that we're working for. What are the different claims that you could be making depending on where you are on this pathway through time? So this is a graph from the Science-Based Target Initiative, and it's kind of looking forward. And so the gray here are your emissions. The blue are the compensations through carbon credits, reducing over time, and you can see that purple starts to come in, and the purple is neutralization through removals. So over time, as they reduce, they're also adding in removal type credits to neutralize some of those emissions with the goal of getting to where everything is fully neutralized at that target year at the end. So let's say we're kind of here maybe in year 3. Now you have an equal balance between emissions and compensation. And so a lot of us would use the language of carbon neutral for something like that. It's a neutralized position, a net zero accounting balance. But the thing with carbon neutral is that it is still seen as jargon. Unless you're carefully defining what you mean and backing up with that sort of narrative and the context there of how are you defining that term, it can be potentially accidentally misleading to your audience. The Commerce Commission actually names carbon neutral as a specific example of jargon to avoid on their website when they're talking about making, sort of exaggerated, puffery jargon claims. They name it because it's something that we all kind of think we know what it means, but it's not clearly defined as one single thing, what is included, what's not included, and hence it could be easily accidentally misinterpreted by your audience. On the other hand, when you have, say, independent verification against a standard or certification against a standard, that standard is a fact. It's an independently defined set of requirements that you are shown to be in compliance with. So for example, your Toitū Net Carbon Zero certified. Toitū Net Carbon Zero is a set of facts. It's a set of requirements that you have been shown to be in alignment with. So you can make that claim with a lot of confidence because it's something that's, it's a set of facts. It's very clearly defined and very easily substantiated. So in this year 3 example, let's say the company is net carbon zero certified, so they're able to talk about that, and they might use the language of carbon neutral when they're having say writing an article about this, but their overall position is not that, hey, we're carbon neutral, it's that we are net carbon zero certified, and that's a much safer claim to be making. Now, what about if that company purchased extra carbon credits? So that blue bar gets a bit longer, and the balance between the emissions and the compensation means that it's a negative total. So what claim can you make here? This is something we're seeing a lot more of now, and it is still hotly under debate. Should you be using negative, positive, minus, something entirely different? What is the right language to use here? Because it's still under debate, it's at a lot more risk of being that accidentally misleading jargon unless you're very carefully defining your terms. And we've seen this happen actually already, where a competitor was accusing someone of, hey, you can't make this claim. How can you back that up? How can you show that? And they were able to sort of explain it and define it, but front-footing that and really explaining what do you mean by that is really important for something around that carbon negative or carbon positive space because it's still under debate. The other option, of course, is to get certified in a framework and against a standard. So Toitū Climate Positive includes that negative emissions accounting balance, but it also includes a range of other requirements to sort of have that net positive impact on the climate. And so then you can make that statement with a lot of confidence and you have all the evidence to substantiate it. So then thinking about, that future state. So right now, maybe we're Toitū net carbon zero, maybe we're Toitū climate positive, but what about, I want to be talking about net zero as well, just like all these other corporates that I'm hearing, they're making these pledges. When can I say that I am net zero? And the thing with net zero, net zero previously was just sort of a phrase about where is your emission balance? Is it net, your gross total and your net total works out to be zero, right? It's an accounting phrase. But thanks in part to the SBTi corporate standard here that Stu mentioned earlier, this is coming to be a clearly defined phrase. And therefore, unless you're aligning with that new sort of increasingly accepted definition, then your claims are at real risk of being accused of greenwash or carbon washing or just getting a lot more scrutiny. So net zero is that future state. It's not a right now thing. It's very unlikely any company can currently claim net zero, because to achieve net zero, it means that you have truly reduced across your value chain your impacts, let's say 95%. You have decarbonized business as usual. It's a new business as usual. And only that final, say 5–10% of emissions, the things that really can't be abated, those are being neutralized through removals. And that, once you're in that position, including your value chain, that's when you can make that statement of we are net zero. So thinking about it as a current state versus future state. So we currently are Toitū net carbon zero certified, and we've done that through these achievements. We've set that commitment of being net zero by 2040. And we have set a series of interim, sort of near and medium term targets and pathways and plans to achieve that end state goal by transforming business as usual. Right. So with those key terms and that language in mind, some of that best practice context, the fact that things are evolving a bit, what do you actually do? How do you talk about your climate action? So I want to take us through a few examples and some frameworks, things that you can adopt and learn from, both what to do and what to avoid. So an overall theme, Stu mentioned this a little bit as well, that sort of the idea of making a headline claim, supporting it with a narrative, and then further substantiating that with achievements and commitments. So this is just a dummy framework, but that sort of framework can be a really nice starting place. So what's your overall headline position? There's your tweet that you can send out. And that tweet can include a link to your website that includes a lot more information to tell that narrative, to support it. So, our example company here is Toitū Carbon Reduce certified. Carbon Reduce means measuring to certain standards and frameworks and managing and reducing those emissions to certain standards and frameworks. And you would then sort of have a link through what do you mean by Toitū requirements, which is on our website, so that it can be clearly independently substantiated. Then further telling the story, what have you achieved so far? What are your emissions? What have you included? What are you excluding? What are you not taking account of? What might you start taking account of going forward? And those ideally would be verified, so you have a lot of confidence in making those statements. Then your commitments, where are you going next? What are you going to do? Both in terms of your targets, but also your plans and your pathways to achieve that. So ideally, you'd be setting a science-aligned target, and then you can talk about the fact that you are in line with, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And therefore, here's our, sort of our 2030 target, our 2040 target, our long-term 2050 target, and how we're going to achieve that, both with things that we can control quite easily, the sort of the quick wins, the medium wins, and then that longer, truly transformational, how on earth are we going to change our business model and our ways of working? How do we design in circularity? So let's look at some of the claims that are being made, what they're doing really well that you can start to learn from and pulling through into your own climate performance claims. So let's start with Steinlager. Steinlager, the full beer range is holds product certification through us. They're Toitū net carbon zero certified for their whole product range. So that looks at the full life cycle. Now, this image here is an example of one of their headline claims that they put out there. So you see this image possibly in some advertising, social media, places like that. And then when you click through, you do a bit of Googling, you end up on their website, and their website takes you through a bit more information. So they're making that headline claim, we're Toitū net carbon zero certification for our products. And then they immediately launch into that narrative. What does this mean? That means this very specific thing. They talk about their independent framework and what they're doing there, but then they also explain it in a little bit more practical terms, right? So the emissions from the entire life cycle of our product, which is still kind of unapproachable jargon, they translate that. It's growing the grain to the length of time it spends in your fridge, so that whole impact. They also, in their press release, did a really nice job of sort of, for a typical, Steiny drinker, this 12 pack emits this much carbon, which is the same as, driving this far in your Hilux or running your barbecue for this long. It makes it a bit more relatable and understandable for your average audience, where climate is still potentially not something that they're really savvy on. Let's see here. So Silver Fern Farms. Now, Silver Fern Farms, they have a Toitū certified net carbon zero beef product that they're selling in the US. It's an export product. And they were the first ones to be using the sort of net carbon zero position. Some of the things they do really nicely, it's that same thing of, they make an overall headline position, and then they support it with some really great information about what do they mean by that? What does that look like specifically for this beef product? Where are the emissions happening? What are they going to do about it? And they have more information coming out as well shortly. The product's sort of just launching around, how are they going to improve this? So they have this net zero carbon current state. How are they going to keep doing better through things like regenerative farming, reduction practices, those sorts of things? And one thing that's interesting to note here, so they were the first ones using that net carbon zero claim, and that was in part, response to questions in their export markets of, how could beef possibly be carbon zero? And adding that word net made it much more readily accepted that, okay, we get it. It's sort of it's a current state. It's a net balance. We understand that, and that you have this ongoing commitment to continue, on that journey towards our collective net zero future. New Zealand Post does a really nice job as well. So one example, they have the person-to-person sending is carbon neutral, and they do use the term carbon neutral, but they've done exactly what you should do. They've gone and defined that term really clearly. They have an excellent diagram to show what they mean here. So that they're defining that jargon. It's becoming, rather than jargon, it's something very clear, very understandable. They also have a lot of great information on what are we doing as a company. So we have our overall headline, we will be carbon neutral business-wide from this date. And then they go through and they tell the story of how they're going to get there. Here are our targets. They are science-aligned targets. Here are some plans that we have. We will be reducing by this much and making up the balance with carbon credits. And so you have a lot of trust in the story that they're telling you, because they show this is what we're thinking about, this is what we're planning, this is what we're doing, and it builds a lot of trust there. Because now we're going to look at some claims that went wrong and how you can avoid those same pitfalls, and building that trust and telling that story and making it clear that there is a pathway and a plan can go a long way towards avoiding some of these pitfalls. So let's look at some of the things that didn't go so well. Corn. So in 2020, they ran an ad campaign in the UK. Now they hold product certification, so a life cycle assessment, carbon reduce type certification from the Carbon Trust in the UK. So they have that. They ran this ad campaign talking about, statements like, I care about climate change and I love my food. So this is a step in the right direction because, eating this helps us reduce our carbon footprint. And that's got to be good. If you care about climate change, take a step in the right direction, sort of that type of messaging. And on screen, they have they reference their certification that they're holding. So that all sounds probably like something that is, feels very reasonable. That sounds great. They're doing the right things. They have product level certification. They probably have good, strong reduction plans. Yes, I could see how I could say this is a climate friendly purchase, right? However, the trick in this case is that they didn't substantiate those claims in their ad. So eating this product reduces my personal carbon footprint compared to what? In what way? Compared to another product, compared to this product over time? What do you mean by this? How can you back up that claim? In what way is my footprint reduced? And they just weren't being specific enough. So there were a bunch of complaints against the ad, and the Advertising Standards Authority in the UK upheld that complaint, and they banned the ad, basically. And they sort of acknowledged that, yes, we see that you're trying to do the right thing, that you're going to be reducing this footprint, but you are not, your claims were not substantiated. You couldn't back these up. And until they can back these things up, then we can't let you run that ad. There's very similar rules here in New Zealand about even accidentally misleading claims. You need to avoid those just as much as purposely misleading claims. And so I think the key message here is to be precise, to be transparent, and always be able to substantiate what do you mean, why, and compared to what, those sorts of questions. When you're testing some ideas here, what would an average person on the street, what kind of questions might they ask? How can you make sure that there's no potential for accidentally misinterpreting what you're saying? This one's a bit more recent. So you might remember last year, Converse, the shoe company, they had this big campaign where they were painting these murals all over the world. This is the one that's in Auckland, with this special paint that was going to clean the air. And that, this mural is 182 trees. It's equivalent to that many trees. And globally, it's the equivalent of planting over 9,000 trees. They made this big splash about it. And immediately there was quite a lot of backlash. The paint does in fact have the property of absorbing some air pollutants when it's exposed to UV light while it's drying. So they paint, and over the period of time while it cures and it dries, it does absorb some things there. However, Converse was vastly overstating the case. It's not anywhere near equivalent to a tree. And it's also, when you start to look, because the data is publicly available, that paint, when you look across its full life cycle, so producing the paint, distributing the paint, and so forth, it is not a carbon sink, it is an emitter. So that one stage of its life while it's drying is not enough to make up for the rest of the carbon used in producing the paint, let alone any sort of extra ambient carbon that it might absorb from the atmosphere. So the claims were torn apart globally in terms of being very much an overstatement of the case and not considering that full life cycle. So if they had gone out and they were very clear and explicit about, while it's drying, it's the equivalent of, not overstating the case with the trees, but while it's drying, it's helping to absorb some carbon, and we've purchased carbon credits to balance out the rest of the life cycle of the paint because it does take carbon to produce it. Maybe they would have been a little bit more successful that way, or even just acknowledging that they haven't assessed the full life cycle of the paint, but they're sort of ignoring all of that stuff below the surface on the iceberg. And unfortunately, it was all publicly available. It was very clear, very obvious, and so that really backfired. So don't overstate the case, and definitely think about your value chain. Even if you don't know the answer, acknowledge that and just be open and clear about that. Finally, one more what not to do. So this is a new and emerging one. Total Energies in the EU. So they rebranded to Total Energies. It's an oil and gas company who was previously known as Total. And as part of their rebranding campaign, they were making lots of really great statements about, new energy sources and so forth, and how they had this great commitment to being carbon neutral by 2050. That's wonderful. They claim that they're on track to that goal, all really great. But this lawsuit has been brought against them to sort of ideally set a bit of a precedent there. And the lawsuit, the basis of it is that you are still investing in oil and gas and fossil fuels. How can you justify saying that you will be carbon neutral by 2050? So equivalent of that net zero future state where this is truly a, no impact on the atmosphere. Anything going into the air is also being pulled out of the air. So this lawsuit is hoping to set precedents in two ways. One, to kind of help rein in some of the oil and gas carbon washing that's going quite rampantly, and sort of reining in and controlling some of that. But the other piece of precedent that they're hoping to set is around, just some of that common understanding about a net zero claim and what does it mean to make a net zero or a future state claim about true neutrality. And I think this is going to be a really interesting one to watch. We probably won't have the results until probably even next year. But what sort of precedents is this going to set? And I think even while we're waiting on some of these precedents, knowing that a lot of things are changing, this sort of particular issue has a theme that I'm seeing both here in New Zealand and overseas again and again in a lot of the recent carbon washing and greenwashing accusations, is that great, so you have these great pledges, you have some really good targets, you have these worthy achievements, that all sounds really wonderful, but what about your business model? And that's exactly where the critique against Total Energies is coming, is you are an oil and gas, a fossil fuel company. How can you possibly justify this behavior? How can you get there? Now, if Total Energies had made it very clear, this is how we're going to phase out fossil fuels and this is what we're going to do, they might have been more successful. But for all of us, I think all of us can think about, what in my business model am I going to have to do differently by 2050 to truly decarbonize? You know, for us at Toitū, it's thinking about our travel footprint. How can we do audits differently, still provide all the same value to our customers without actually having to get on a plane to go see them? What can we do in that sense? You know, a fast-moving consumer goods, how do you take account into that full supply chain, distribution and freight, designing in circularity, you know, consumerism, whatever it is that fits into your business model? We all have some work to do to think about, if I have this future state commitment, what can I start doing now? What can I start planning? What can I start committing to, and start testing and experimenting to answer that question of, what about your business model? Now, like I said, this is all kind of in flux. A lot of things are transitioning, and it's going to be a sticky space for a little while. And I'm sure there will be more pitfalls where someone is very, you know, doing the right thing and accidentally gets it wrong. But at Toitū, we've been making a few changes recently with the carbon programs to try and help support our clients to be aligning with this leading practice as much as possible. So one of the changes, you may well be aware of this already if you're one of our clients, or you might have noticed throughout this presentation, Toitū Carbon Zero is transitioning. So Toitū Carbon Zero is now becoming Toitū Net Carbon Zero. So just a very small addition, the word net in there. We're not changing anything about the program requirements. We're not changing the rules, the work that our wonderful clients are doing. It's still that same commitment to, you know, a neutral position right now, and an ongoing commitment to keep reducing and heading for that future state, but reflecting the fact that, you know, those certified achievements are not yet absolute zero. They're not yet a truly sort of neutralized net zero position. They are a net accounting balance position. And so we've pulled in that word net to kind of help illustrate that transition on the road towards the future state. So you can communicate this with a little bit more transparency, precision. Like I mentioned with Silverfern Farms, they had good results when they were testing this in the US market. It just made more sense to their audience. One other change that we're making is to some of the documents that our clients receive. So the certificate, disclosure pages, things to help support our clients in communicating their story. We've just rejigged things a little bit so that it sort of aligns with these same themes, presenting a headline position, supporting that with a narrative, and these links will take you to our website where we define all of these terms and these frameworks and so forth, so it's very clearly defined as an independently substantiable fact. Supporting those the different pillars of action with achievements and commitments. You know, what have we done? You know, verified measurements and reductions, compensation, impact contributions, and what is our commitments, ongoing commitments, including recognizing where those reduction targets are science aligned to either 1.5 or well below 2 degrees. So all of our carbon clients, as they kind of go through their next cycle or so, will start to see some changes in their documents to hopefully help them align with these leading practice climate performance claims. Right, so next we have some time for questions, and I can see that there's been quite a few questions coming through in the Q&A box, and Stu has done a great work of answering some of these as they're coming in. Please keep your questions coming into the Q&A box and we'll keep answering those. And I think we'll start with Kat's question here. So is Toitū looking at a nature positive product business certification, sort of including other attributes other than emissions? Yes, we are. We're still working out what does that look like in terms of basically with the theme of how do you ensure that you're giving more to our world than you're taking. So that full, nature positive, but also thinking about people, thinking about, business, economic sustainability, and making sure that those things are fitting together in a way that you can have a lot of confidence that you are managing and on the pathway of continual improvement to have that positive impact. I don't have any sort of timeframes yet in terms of when that's going to be ready and for testing and piloting, but it is something that we're developing right now. That is an equally evolving space with standards and frameworks and definitions. So that's where we're exploring right now. Basically, who's where do we want to align? So. Let's see here. So from Jessica, can you recommend any consultants that can help pull together content like copy to help organizations communicate appropriately on these topics? That is such a good question. We work with the Comms Co-op, Aotearoa. They're a co-op of freelancers. They help us and they're pretty practiced at sustainability claims, so they're quite good. Kath Duar's Good Sense. They are a wonderful agency in Auckland, and Kath is so good with greenwashing. So she's really helpful, and her team can probably provide quite a lot of value there. I am sure there are dozens of other great consultants that I just don't happen to know off the top of my head. And of course, you do, all of our members do get some resources to help support making claims. And we are looking at how can we continue to give you guys more resources and help you do more, whether it's an annual report or a tweet, how can we help you communicate these things more usefully? Let's see here. We have an anonymous one. Will you still use the brand net zero carbon if selling non-adjusted emissions? Stu, do you want to take that one? The non-adjusted?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so as I showed it in my slides, we're going through a transition phase where essentially there's limited carbon credits that are adjusted available in the marketplace anyway. And if they do trickle into the market, we're anticipating them to be sucked up by the likes of Corsair. So on one of Austin's slides around how we're framing up the narrative, we are including disclosure in terms of the provenance of the carbon credits and whether they are included within the national inventory or not. So that's addressing that double claim disclosure and also provenance back to those credits. So on the bottom left of Austin's screen there's also links back to the Toitū's standards and a glossary. So the thing is that there's only so much you can put on a disclosure like this on the screenshot, and then for stakeholders that really want to drill into it further, we have links back to the terminologies and provenance of some of the stuff, because there's a lot of words on that disclosure document that might need people to actually drill into and get definitions on.
Great. Any other questions? I think Stu, looks like there's a follow-up from John Clements. And we've got another hearty endorsement for Kath. She really is great. I don't know, she was on the project recently talking about carbon washing. She knows her stuff really well. She's delightful. Let's see here. So a similar question to the earlier one about Steinlager. How can a buyer benefit from buying a climate positive, product? Example, wood over steel or concrete. So assuming that the life cycle assessments of wood would reflect that, how do you convey that message? Is there a monitored gain at accounting? That's a... Yeah.
Do you want me to comment on?
I do.
So this is all about supplier engagement and really addressing that value chain of your operations and transforming. A really good example at a global scale is Volvo did their whole value chain emissions assessment. They identified that steel was a huge component of their value chain emissions underneath the iceberg on the slide, Austin's slide. They then said, okay, how can we address this? So they worked with their steel suppliers to say, hey, how can we get lower emissions steel into our manufacturing and really cut down on emissions on that part of our footprint? So just to expand a bit more on this, you need to be aware that when it comes to your value chain emissions, even if you're dealing with climate neutral or similar sort of claimed products, you still need to measure the gross emissions of that product, okay? The benefit you then get is the fact that you'd anticipate that those products are actively reducing their emissions faster than the sort of sector-wide average because they're on a program to actually decarbonize. So there's an element of reducing your emissions intensity of the purchased product that you're getting, whether it's wood, steel, or concrete. And then when it comes to looking at your net position, if it's already been offset under a carbon neutral claim, you can deduct that from your obligations of offsetting. So you don't need to double offset. So hopefully that makes sense.
And I suppose in terms of like something like wood over steel, where it is potentially sort of naturally a lower emission than something like steel, it's that same, it all still comes out in the wash around, are you having to, what's that net position, and how do you account for that in your impacts? And you would get credit for it, whether it's sort of naturally a lower footprint or it's been sort of pre-compensated. Yeah, hopefully that answers your question. If not, please type in another one. As a commonly understood data point, what is the average New Zealander per capita annual emission? So is this kind of the most relevant data point for a consumer in terms of, I'm assuming you mean for that sort of comparability, kind of, how big is your footprint and how much of a difference will this, buying this product or making this lifestyle change make for you? It varies quite a bit. I want to say, Stu, is it about 8 tons a head on average?
I'm going to put my hands up and say I don't know, to be honest.
Yeah.
People on the call will probably be aware of various statistics that get thrown out there, but it all needs to be taken in the context, right? So, if you're purchasing certain products and services, how does that flow through to your footprint? And also the accuracy hierarchy of how you're measuring it. So, like we've been talking about, you can sort of estimate your emissions based on the dollars you spend on a particular product, or do you take advantage of a specifically measured product to say, this Steinlager beer is X amount of emissions. I'm actually going to do that a lot more accurately and have a more refined measurement.
Yeah, and I think the sort of making things relevant can vary quite a bit. So Steinlager, they deliberately chose driving in a Hilux or using my barbecue because they knew their audience. They knew that would relate to them. Whereas in other cases, I know companies have looked at things like, how many business class flights to the UK can I, is this equivalent to? How far can I drive in a typical car? Or even volume things like how many Olympic swimming pools would that carbon fill, kind of just helping to put things into scale. So I think the most relevant data point for a consumer can vary quite a bit. And it really depends on who is your consumer, who is your audience, and how sophisticated is their knowledge. Because I think even, per capita annual emissions and kind of thinking about that, there is data, but it's not necessarily something that is quite as relatable potentially as some much more simple things. I had my barbecue on for an hour, or I drove to the grocery store in my EV, those kinds of things. Right. Any other questions? We have a couple more minutes, and if there are any other questions that we run out of time for, we will write up some responses and send those out afterwards. We will be sending out the slides and the recording to everyone who is here today or wasn't able to attend today. We'll publish all that for everyone. And any other resources that we can think of, I'll provide a few other links. Highly recommend the Commerce Commission's environmental guidance. It's really helpful and quite understandable and relatable, and very similar to a lot of the other market sort of legislation overseas as well. So the same sort of principles around substantiation and even being accidentally misleading is still problematic. Let's see here, one last question here. If a business is making climate positive claims to their customer, like helps you reduce your carbon footprint, what is the best way to separate the business impact versus the customer's personal footprint? I think that comes back to being really, really precise. So if a business is making that claim, you would want to put it in the context of how is it helping that impact? Is it helping, voting with your dollar by supporting a business that's making the right choices, and, is kind of contributing to that greater transition, and we're all, voting for and endorsing businesses that are giving this a good shot. Or if, the product or the service is, you have an actual life cycle analysis and you can show that it has a lower footprint or it's been pre-offset, that those will directly benefit your customer. So your customer knows that they're getting, pre-offset electricity or pre-compensated, printing service, something like that, so that they know that their impact by making that purchasing choice is already effectively lower or neutralized. So I think there's those two components there. The business impact of let's preferentially treat businesses who are giving this a go and who are trying, and reward them with our business, and that kind of helping with transitioning. But also in some cases, specific data that this will genuinely lower your personal footprint or your business's personal footprint in this way. Would you add anything to that, Stu?
No, that's, spot on.
Great. Thank you so much, everyone. Really have appreciated your time and your attention today. And we will send all these things out in the next couple of days so that you have all this information to tap back into. And of course, all of our clients and members are always welcome to get back in touch and see how we can further help you communicating your certifications and your claims. And if you're not with us, you should be. We're very nice and very helpful. So thank you, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and wrap this up and really appreciate your time. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.